Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Harris County Flood Control District's virtual community engagement meeting, where we'll be discussing the San Jacinto Regional Watershed Master Drainage Plan. This virtual community meeting is being offered by the Harris County Flood Control District to continue to share vital information with the community, especially during this period when in-person public meetings have been suspended due to safety concerns from the COVID-19 pandemic. Before we get started tonight, I wanted to share a quick message from Precinct 1 Commissioner Rodney Ellis, who's called in to kick things off this evening. Commissioner, over to you.
Hello, this is Harris County Commissioner Rodney Ellis. Thank you for taking time from your busy schedule to join us this evening. These meetings are important. Getting your feedback and opinions on flood control projects is how we can ensure that projects work for you and your neighbors. Flooding is an ever-present threat to our community. It remains one of Harris County's highest priorities. As we approach the third anniversary of Hurricane Harvey later this month, we can't forget that many of our communities are vulnerable to flooding. Since joining Commissioners Court in 2017, I have fought for equity to be at the center of our decision-making when it comes to prioritizing flood control projects across the county. In 2018, Harris County voters passed a $2.5 billion flood bond that gave underserved communities their first opportunity to receive real flood mitigation. The explicit ballot language required a process for the equitable distribution of flood bonds to reduce flood risk. After decades of neglect, lower income areas and communities of color and flood-prone areas have been experiencing flooding of homes and streets with each hard rain. Because these communities have been passed over for years due to an inequitable federal formula. That formula would prioritize flood mitigation projects based on property values, not people. That serves only those who live in higher income neighborhoods rather than those in the most need. With these guidelines, we are now able to prioritize areas that have a higher risk for loss of life due to disasters and take longer to recover from those disasters. Tonight's meeting will focus on an upcoming study of the San Jacinto River watershed that will guide flood control in making your area more resilient to flooding. Your feedback tonight will make an enormous difference as we work together to make this project the best that it can be. Thank you for being a part of tonight's call, and thank you to the Harris County Flood Control District for hosting this virtual meeting. We're looking forward to hearing your comments.
Thanks so much, Commissioner, for kicking things off this evening. And while we are welcomed by Commissioner Ellis, I do just want to note that this study spans multiple counties and all 4 Harris County Commissioners' precincts. So we're thrilled to have representatives from those offices with us tonight. My name is Emily Waddell, and I'm with the Flood Control District's communications team. I'm joined tonight by a team of subject matter experts from the Flood Control District and other regional entities to ensure we keep you up to date on these important flood mitigation efforts in your community. We're also joined by staff from area elected official offices and community associations. Welcome, and thank you for joining us tonight. We're thrilled to see the community so engaged in this project and look forward to sharing updates. This virtual public meeting will begin with a presentation to share an overview of the San Jacinto Regional Watershed Master Drainage Plan. The presentation will be followed by a virtual Q&A session with Flood Control District team members and experts from regional entities. Attendees are able to submit comments and questions through the website or via phone. Any comments not addressed during tonight's Q&A session will receive a response from the Flood Control District after the event. Instructions on how to participate in the virtual open house are included on the slides, on this virtual meeting webpage, and on the Flood Control District website. I will also share a reminder of these instructions when we reach the Q&A portion of the meeting. I'll now transition to Terry Barr, who's overseeing this project for the consultant team and will share information about the effort. Terry, over to you.
Great, thanks, Emily. Good evening. My name's Terry Barr, and I'm the project director on the engineering consultant team for the San Jacinto Regional Watershed Master Drainage Plan, or the SANJAC study for short. On behalf of study partners, the Harris County Flood Control District, the San Jacinto River Authority, Montgomery County, and the City of Houston, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to present to you this evening. Tonight's presentation is intended to give you an overview of the SANJAC study with a focus on the recommendations and path forward. I'll start with the goals and objectives of the study and then briefly discuss some of the background and current flooding conditions. I'll talk about the various types of mitigation planning conducted and go over a bit of the details on strategies. I'll also be giving an update on the implementation and next steps. Lastly, the study partners and I will take questions from you, the public. The goal of the Watershed Master Plan is to prepare a comprehensive flood mitigation plan for the San Jacinto River's major streams that will identify vulnerability to flood hazards that result in loss of life and property, will develop approaches to enhance public information and flood assessment capabilities during a disaster, and will evaluate flood mitigation strategies that can be implemented both in the near term and the long term to improve community experience. In a nutshell, we want to build a plan that covers the whole watershed and identifies our current flood risks, lays out a plan to reduce that risk in the future, and looks at how we can communicate more effectively and share that information with you. This goal will be accomplished by focusing on specific objectives, the first objective being flood mitigation planning, which focuses on reducing flooding and removing people from high-risk areas. Flood assessment focuses on providing real-time information to decision makers in the public to help them make judgments during a disaster. Another objective, flood response planning, focuses on emergency management practices and flood response during a disaster. Finally, the study includes a robust communication and education effort with the public as well as with stakeholders throughout the region. The study is 75% funded through the FEMA Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. The remaining 25% is funded by our 4 study partners. So let's start with a bit of background of the San Jacinto River watershed. The upper portion of the San Jacinto River watershed included in this study encompasses nearly 2,900 square miles from Harris, Montgomery, and several other surrounding counties, the majority of which drain through Lake Houston. This study focuses on approximately 535 miles located in 11 different watersheds, which are shown on the map. The study starts at I-10 and moves upstream to the watershed headwaters in 5 different counties. The map shows the extent of the watershed, major roads, and population centers. On average, the watershed receives about 49 inches of rainfall annually. Unlike the lower portion, which covers most of Harris County, there's significant vertical relief in the upper San Jacinto watershed, with approximately a 450-foot elevation difference from the headwaters in Walker County to the Houston Ship Channel downstream of I-10. With a population of roughly 1.6 million in the watershed, there is a diverse land use makeup consisting of rural, agricultural, forested areas, and urban centers. The upper portion of the San Jacinto River watershed began to grow in population in the early 1880s with the construction of several railroads and the ensuing economic growth. Following the oil boom in the 1930s and 40s, the Houston region expanded. Lake Houston was built in 1954 to meet the water supply needs of the growing population. With this growth came increased runoff and encroachment of many of these major streams in this region. The National Flood Insurance Act of 1968 created the National Flood Insurance Program and was intended to encourage state and local governments to constrict development of land exposed to flood hazards. FEMA flood maps were developed to identify those flood-prone areas. Construction of many of the large planned developments, such as Kingwood and the Woodlands, began in the 1970s and 80s. The first FEMA maps for the city of Houston and unincorporated Harris County also came out in the early 1970s and have been updated several times since. By the time drainage criteria standards and floodplain maps were published in the 1980s and 90s, much of the development had occurred in flood areas. In the last 20 years, there's been a significant attention paid to both floodplain mapping and development criteria with the intent of reducing flood risk. Since Hurricane Harvey in 2017, that push has been further accelerated, with many communities development and floodplain criteria to be much more stringent. In response to this, significant floodplain modeling and mapping efforts, such as Harris County's MapNext program, have been initiated to provide better information about both riverine and urban flooding. Historical records go back in some areas about 100 years, but the last 25 years have produced several devastating storms to the residents of the San Jacinto watershed. The October 1994 storm was the storm of record for more than 20 years. With more than 18 inches of rainfall across the watershed, the elevation in Lake Houston increased over 8 feet from its normal pooled elevation. The last 4 years have proven to be very challenging for residents of the watershed, with 3 major flood events causing disruption, property damage, and loss of life. The most notable of these events is, of course, Hurricane Harvey. In 2017, Harvey brought between 22 and 34 inches of across the watershed in a 6-day period. Rivers and streams throughout the watershed experienced record inflows and elevations during the rainfall event. Every major stream in the watershed exceeded previous record flow and stage elevations. Thousands of structures reported flooding in Harris and Montgomery and surrounding counties. Since Harvey, Tropical Storm Imelda has delivered another blow to the watershed, flooding homes and businesses that, in some cases, were still recovering from Harvey. The ultimate goal of this study is to identify measures that can improve resiliency in the San Jacinto watershed, improving flood mitigation, flood warning, and flood response. The map on your screen shows the density of flooding reported in the upper San Jacinto watershed over the last 5 years. As you can see, there are several identifiable floodplain concentrations in the lower portion. It should be noted that this data is based on information provided to the study team. Data was not available for all the counties, but these concentrations generally match development patterns in the San Jacinto watershed and the findings of our study. Now, as I mentioned earlier, one of our goals was to identify vulnerability to flood hazards, causing both loss of life and property. Now, this means taking an in-depth look at current drainage patterns using both detailed modeling and historical information. Complex computer models were prepared to help assess the watershed's vulnerability to flooding. The models developed used the most Atlas 14 rainfall data, digital terrain information, and modeling technologies to provide an understanding of the San Jacinto watershed. The study team developed a single comprehensive model of the San Jacinto watershed streams, the first of its kind for the region. In addition, the study team compared the models to 4 historical storms, including Hurricane Harvey, and made adjustments to improve the accuracy of the models and ensure a realistic representation of the watershed. Developing these models was a critical part of the planning process because it allowed the team to identify current flood risks and set a baseline for comparison. Each flood reduction project that was considered is measured against this baseline conditions modeling to determine if it's going to reduce flooding. The result of the baseline conditions modeling is a significant amount of information that can be used to identify flooding locations and sources. One set of products is the flow and patterns of the watershed. This information gives the team an understanding of how much runoff accumulates and where it goes. This product is also used to develop flood inundation mapping and flood profiles, which can help us assess which buildings and structures are most vulnerable to flooding in the watershed. In general, the modeling indicates that structures within the floodplain are at a higher flood risk than shown in the FEMA flood maps. And this is largely due to having more accurate rainfall data and better modeling information. Now, as I mentioned, the modeling helps us understand flow patterns and flow accumulation in the watershed. The arrows in this map show the direction of flow in the stream, and the size of the lines represent the peak flows experienced in a major storm. A larger line indicates a higher peak flow. The San Jacinto watershed collects runoff from 2,840 square miles and funnels it through Lake Houston. Now, our analysis shows that flows in the downstream portions of the watershed can come from several sources. Spring Creek, the West Fork, and the East Fork receive a tremendous amount of flow from both their own watersheds as well as others upstream. For example, the East Fork also receives flow from both Caney Creek and Peach Creek. These additional flows can contribute to flooding on the East Fork. Understanding flow sources and accumulation can also help determine where potential improvement projects can make the greatest impact. With significant portions of the watershed flows coming from Spring Creek, Lake Creek, the West Peach and Caney Creeks, and the East Fork, projects in those watersheds have a higher potential for reducing flows downstream. So the first step is to identify where we see the highest flood risks. The study team used the baseline modeling that I was just talking about to determine the number of structures that are expected to flood for the next 50 years if there are no changes. The number of potentially flooded structures, such as homes, businesses, and other facilities, vary throughout the different sub-watersheds within the San Jacinto watershed. The team used property data and standard practices to calculate the expected damages over the next 50 years in millions of dollars. Spring Creek, the West Fork, and Cypress Creek are the watersheds with the highest expected damage numbers, which is unsurprising given that they are more developed than some of the other watersheds. Using the calculated damages I just mentioned and historical floodplain data, the team identified 48 different damage centers. These are areas where we see clusters of flooded structures for a range of different flood events. Identifying these damage center areas help the team focus on areas and projects that have the most potential for flood reduction. So, how do we begin to address the flood risks in the watershed? The main focus of the SANJAC study was to evaluate and recommend flood mitigation strategies aimed at just that. One of the goals of this study is to develop flood mitigation strategies to improve long-term resilience. Flood mitigation planning focused on ways that we can physically reduce flooding or remove people from flood risk. Following a watershed-wide approach, we identified and evaluated projects that had been previously shown in prior studies and recognized new flood reduction projects. Flood warning planning focused on flood warning capabilities in the watershed. The team coordinated with several agencies about their interest in gauges and made recommendations for installation of new gauges at additional locations. Flood response planning focused on potential improvements that could be made to the current emergency management response and the information available to emergency responders and the public. As part of this process, we coordinated with emergency management agencies about their procedures. We provided some recommendations for improvements, and we identified potential roadway and critical infrastructure flooding. This collection of strategies makes up the San Jacinto Regional Watershed Master Drainage Plan. Now, with respect to large-scale flood mitigation efforts, the focus is really on two primary approaches: detention storage and channel conveyance. Detention storage is accomplished with regional detention basins, which are man-made impoundments that capture runoff, hold it, and then release it at a slower rate. This results in lower flows downstream and subsequently lower water surface elevations. Note that these are not lakes. These are dry detention facilities that would only hold back water during and immediately after a storm event. Channel conveyance increases are accomplished through channel improvements. Excavation in the channel allows for more flow capacity and lower flood elevations. Channel improvements can provide significant reductions in flood elevations in the immediate project area. Using both of these strategies, the study team analyzed 25 projects across the San Jacinto River watershed. Of these, 16 were included in the long-term flood reduction plan. These are shown in red and numbered. The plan includes 10 large regional detention facilities, comprising approximately 229,000 acre-feet, and 6 channel projects covering about 38.5 stream miles. The overall plan, based on our current cost estimates, costs between $2.9 and $3.3 billion. And while that is a high price tag, consider that the watershed covers a few thousand square miles, and there is no single simple solution that's going to address flooding across the region. A series of large-scale improvements is needed to reduce the risk. So if you look at the flood reduction with the proposed projects, there's about a 44% reduction in the number of structures at risk of flooding in the 1% annual chance event, or ACE. This is equivalent to the 100-year storm. And there's more than a 40% reduction of at-risk structures for the 2% and 4% ACE storms. Those represent about the 50 and 5-year storms. Those are significant reductions. The 0.2% ACE or 500-year reduction is approximately 50%, but consider that the 0.2% ACE flood elevations exceed Hurricane Harvey levels by a noticeable margin. Constructing the recommended projects will reduce flood damages by more than $755 million over the next several decades. In addition, flood-prone property and roads could be protected, and long-term economic benefits may result from the flood reduction. There's also a substantial flood elevation reduction along major evacuation routes like I-45 and I-69 that could improve mobility during a major event. The map shows water surface elevations or elevation reductions across the watershed after all the recommended projects are implemented. You can see that in many areas, including major roadways like I-45, I-69, and State Highway 99, you would see a substantial reduction for the 1% annual chance event or 100-year storm. Beyond the structural project component study, we also considered regional policy. While our study did not perform significant analysis to provide data for various policy components, our recommendations do speak to the importance of policies such as detention and floodplain preservation. It's important to note that local detention is a critical flood mitigation tool for development and capital projects. The future growth projections we used from the Texas Water Development Board and the Harris-Galveston Subsidence District showed development expanding around the current urban centers over the next 50 years. Modeling these projected changes in development shows that detention keeps flows from increasing as development occurs. It's also important to note that drainage does not consider political boundaries. With that in mind, the study recommends that consistent detention policy should be implemented throughout the watershed for any projects that increase flows. The study also recommends that a comprehensive impact analysis be performed for any project that might affect the same flows. The analysis should look beyond the property limits and as far downstream as possible. The models developed as part of this study could facilitate such an analysis all the way downstream of Lake Houston. Floodplain preservation is another important measure to prevent increased risk of flooding as the region grows. The best way to protect people and property from flooding is to avoid building in flood-prone areas. It is well known that building in the floodplain can create negative impacts upstream and certainly downstream of the site. That being said, preventing landowners from developing in the floodplain may not always be a feasible solution, and the cost of acquiring right-of-way can be very high for public entities. The estimated property value in the 100-year floodplain, just along these major streams in the San Jacinto watershed, is between $2 and $3 billion based on our current appraisal data. The study recommends consistent policies across the various jurisdictions in the San Jacinto watershed that encourage limiting development in the floodplain, acquiring floodplain property when it's available, and requiring that fill placed in the floodplain be mitigated so that adverse impacts can be avoided. Another option is buyouts. As we were performing the study, it quickly became apparent that while the recommended projects can provide a substantial benefit, many structures will still be at risk of flooding given their location and elevation. Structures at risk from inundation during the 50% or 2-year and 20% or 5-year storm events may see a reduced frequency of flooding, but will likely continue to flood during major events. In some cases, it is more cost-effective to buy out frequently flooded properties. Just as a point of reference, we estimate that buyout costs of structures at risk from the 50% and 20% ACE storms, just along these major streams, is about $190 million. Now, we certainly realize that there is more to buyouts than just cost, because these are people's homes, people's businesses. But a comprehensive buyout strategy that includes communication with property owners is an important step to eliminating some of these flood risks. Flood warning planning focused on expanding flood warning capabilities that are already available in the San Jacinto watershed. The Harris County flood warning system has a robust gauge network within the county and in the immediate surrounding area. The San Jacinto River Authority has many of its own gauges that are accessible through the Harris County flood warning system as well. Including the USGS, there are rainfall gauges, elevation gauges, and flow gauges, all of which provide valuable information and more lead time for emergency managers and the public to make decisions during a flood event. In addition, the flood warning system includes inundation mapping capabilities, as shown in the graphic, which shows portions of Spring and Willow Creek during Hurricane Harvey. The modeling developed as part of this study could be leveraged to expand inundation mapping into the San Jacinto watershed. We met with several agencies, including the Harris County Flood Control District, the San Jacinto River Authority, Montgomery County, and the U.S. Geological Survey. Based on their input, the team recommended 26 additional gauges throughout the watershed. Of those, have already been installed or are being installed. The total estimated cost of gauge installation is between $250,000 and $500,000, depending on the infrastructure needed to deliver the actual data. There could be additional gauges also if local authorities have specific needs or areas of concern. This is one of the many flood reduction strategies that could be accomplished in the short term. Flood response planning included several tasks aimed at evaluating current emergency management procedures. The study team met with emergency managers from across the watershed and discussed their current communications protocols, both internally and public. We also looked at the potential for flooding of critical infrastructure and roadways, some of which are necessary evacuation routes. We also conducted a workshop with emergency managers to discuss these important topics and gain further insight into flood response needs. What came out of the study are recommendations for improvements to documentation and staffing, communication, both in and with the public, flood monitoring capabilities, and public education. Our investigation of critical infrastructure focused on city and county facilities, police stations, fire and EMS stations, public works facilities like water and water treatment plants, hospitals, and other such facilities. Of the 1,460 facilities that were classified as critical in the watershed, 200 39 of them are potentially at risk from flooding during a major storm like Hurricane Harvey. Finally, an evaluation of roadway flooding throughout the watershed looked at all types of roadways, including those classified as evacuation routes. The study findings show that 4 potential evacuation route crossings may be susceptible to flooding during a major flood event. One additional that was included in the study was a sedimentation and vegetation plan. Now, this was not a comprehensive evaluation, but rather a review of existing data, and recommendations for future analysis. As part of the analysis, the team developed annual sediment rating curves for the 7 major subwatersheds in the San Jacinto watershed. Now, as I said just a second ago, this is not a comprehensive study, but a first step toward a regional sediment management plan. The study prepared an inventory of sediment sources and identified a series of common sediment management strategies to be investigated and potentially implemented. Our investigation found that sediment has been steadily deposited in Lake Houston since the dam was constructed in 1954. The recent U.S. Army Corps of Engineers dredging project has removed approximately 3% of that deposited sediment. In addition, historical stream gauge data indicates that the majority of sediments are contributed by Cypress Creek, Spring Creek, and the West Fork. The report also identified nearly 50 sediment management strategies that could be employed, including sediment traps, stream restoration projects, sand mines, and more. Recommendations were made for several of these sediment management strategies along the West Fork and Spring Creek. The next step is to complete a regional sediment management plan with more detailed sediment transport and volume analysis, and to identify new stream gauge locations to pinpoint sediment sources. For the potential management strategies, feasibility studies for potential pilot projects and additional analysis of dam complex, sediment tunnels, and stream stabilization need to be performed. So, how do we move these recommendations forward such that we can achieve tangible flood reduction in the watershed? This is where implementation planning comes in. The current draft implementation plan looks at both short-term and long-term strategies for flood reduction. Short-term strategies can be fully or partially implemented within 5 years. Long-term strategies will last more than 5 years, perhaps decades. For the short-term strategies, one of the first things that should be done is to form a San Jacinto River Vision Group who would foster collaboration amongst the various jurisdictions and interests and maintain the momentum of the study toward implementation. With the state flood planning effort in its early stages, the regional flood planning groups are currently being formed. In the San Jacinto watershed, this group would be well suited to fulfilling the role of a vision group. The SanJack study will be submitted to the regional flood planning group for the review and consideration once the group is formed. Other short-term strategies include policy updates. Complementary drainage, detention, and floodplain analysis criteria could be implemented to provide a consistent standard for development and flood mitigation in the watershed. Adding the recommended gauges to the flood warning system would provide better real-time information to a wider constituency. Implementing the recommendations for flood response would help improve awareness of flood risks to the public and communication of disaster, both internally and with the public. Moving forward with buyouts of frequently flooded structures would provide an immediate reduction of flood damages. Updating floodplain maps for major streams and tributaries would provide better flood risk information, help avoid risks to people and property, and the development of watershed plans for smaller tributaries will lay out a path to identifying and prioritizing flood reduction projects throughout the region. There are a lot of steps that can be implemented at least initiated in the short term. The implementation of long-term strategies includes the project development, design, and construction of the detention and channel improvement projects, as well as long-term floodplain preservation through property acquisition. But where do we start? The 16 projects were ranked based on a variety of factors. The resulting rankings provided a good distribution of projects across the watershed, making this a truly regional plan. The study team considered a variety of project scoring criteria to make this a regional plan. We looked at historical floodplain as well as flood damages identified in our modeling. We also gave significant value to flood reduction benefits, such as how many homes can be protected. The study team also looked at costs and possible funding sources. In addition, we looked at social factors, such as low to moderate income areas, to ensure that we were providing access to flood reduction for all areas in the region. Using these criteria, the team scored and ranked each of the projects. This ranking sets the order for projects. Now, let's think about that last statement for a minute. I think it's important to note that the San Jacinto Plan is intended to be a living document. These rankings are based on current conditions and assumptions, but we live in an ever-changing world. Rankings will need to be constantly reevaluated as conditions change. Another important consideration is that the ranking does not lock any given project into that order. Factors such as funding opportunities, different project champions, and changing needs in the watershed make it likely that the order will change throughout the life of the plan. Ultimately, the plan is to select the current top projects and move forward with project development. This includes securing funding and performing a detailed feasibility and preliminary engineering. The SANJAC study represents an important first step in the project lifecycle planning, which lays the groundwork for future success. The second step is project definition. Definition phase includes identifying the agency and consulting teams who develop the projects, identifying and securing funding for the project, and additional feasibility and preliminary engineering to really clarify and nail down what that project's going to be. The next step is the project construction phase. This includes acquiring the land and easements needed for the project, developing the construction drawings, identifying and securing any environmental permitting, and project construction. Once the projects are in place, continuous operation and maintenance of each project is necessary to ensure that it continues to function as intended to provide the maximum flood reduction benefit. Funding is one of the most important considerations to the recommended projects. Each project is a significant investment and will require a number of steps in order to develop, acquire the right-of-way, address environmental concerns, and construct the project. There are a variety of funding sources that could potentially be leveraged to pay for parts of each of these projects. Federal agencies such as the Federal Emergency Management Agency, Housing and Urban Development, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers can provide funding through a variety of programs. Also, potential funding sources at the state level, including the Texas Water Development Board and the General Land Office. Flood protection grants and the new Flood Infrastructure Fund are both available through the Water Development Board. As I mentioned earlier, the state flood plan process is just beginning. The inclusion of this study and its recommendations in the regional plan will be a key in making these projects eligible for state funding. Local funding through general tax revenue, bond elections, and private investment through partnerships with public agencies are all options that could help push these projects forward as well. The graphic on the screen conveys an important message. There are a lot of funding sources that can help with many types of projects, each with their own requirements. It's important to remember that the availability and requirements of funding options may change, but preparedness is essential to successfully securing project dollars. Having a plan with specifically identified projects, costs, and benefits will allow the vision group to seize those funding opportunities when they're presented. The study also initiated a robust communication and outreach effort, which included communication with our study partners, as well as the surrounding jurisdictions and the Houston Area Council. In addition, the study team conducted outreach efforts for the public, as well as with specific interest groups. Tonight's presentation is one example of that outreach. There's also a site that provides general information about the study, www.sanjacstudy.org. As the study is completed, more information will be added to the website. So, we have covered a lot of ground this evening, but there are some important points that we would like you to remember as we close out the presentation. With respect to the existing vulnerability to flooding, Lake Houston acts like a funnel for more than 2,800 square miles of watershed. So there is a significant amount of flow passing near Spring, Humble, Kingwood, and other areas in the lower portion of the watershed. In addition, updated modeling indicates that the flood risk is actually higher than is shown in the current FEMA flood maps. So remapping would be beneficial. As it relates to reducing flooding, it is important to remember that there is no single solution to reduce flooding across the San Jacinto watershed. Each of the recommended projects will take many years to implement, but each one will provide incremental benefit. In the short term, alternative strategies to reduce flood risk include assisted detention and floodplain policy that can help mitigate flows as the region continues to grow, and augmenting the existing flood warning system with new gauges to expand the existing coverage and improve information to decision makers and the public. Successful implementation of these recommendations will require that a San Jacinto River Vision Group and individual project champions help maintain the momentum started by the development of this plan. By working to implement both the short-term and long-term strategies recommended in the SANJAC study, we can make this plan a success. In order to make this plan a success, though, collaboration between the various agencies in the watershed is crucial. So once again, I would like to thank each of you for your interest and your attention to tonight's presentation. As we move forward toward the completion of this study and into the implementation phase, we hope that you will continue to stay engaged. Your continued interaction with the interest groups, with public officials and elected representatives will be a key component in maintaining the momentum of the San Jacinto Regional Watershed Master Drainage Plan. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Terry, for that helpful overview of this project. Before we move into the Q&A session tonight, I just want to echo what Terry said at the end there. We would love to hear from you on this and other efforts rolling out across our region. If you have additional comments or questions as this effort moves forward, or if you would like to sign up to receive updates on the study, please visit www.sanjacstudy.org. Community engagement, as Terry mentioned, is a vital component of the work that we do, and we invite your continued participation as this project moves forward. As a reminder, there are 3 ways to submit a comment about this project during tonight's session. You can submit a comment on this site in the box near the presentation live stream. You can also submit a comment on the study website at www.sanjacstudy.org. And you can also submit a comment via phone. If you're joining us via phone tonight, please press *3 to leave a voicemail message, and that will be considered just like all of the comments that are coming in through the text box. Additionally, I'd like to reiterate that any questions not addressed during tonight's Q&A session will receive a response from the Flood Control District after the event. As Terry mentioned, we've moved through a great deal of information tonight, and I did see a few questions from Paul Eschenfelder, Michael Sullivan, and Richard Payne asking about access to the presentation from this meeting. So we will be posting the slides presented tonight and a recording of this live stream on the Flood Control District's website and YouTube channel. Joining Terry for our Q&A session tonight are Dina Green, Gary Bezemek, and Jean Chen, who are leading this effort for the Flood Control District. We also have Adam Eaton with Houston Public Works, Matt Barrett with the San Jacinto River Authority, and others on the phone as well. Thank you for taking the time to be with us this evening to discuss this study. So now we will move into our Q&A session. Terry, our first question is going to come to you, and it's from Dr. David Abraham. How does the model build in the difference between bayous and channels that are natural versus those that are paved? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So like I said, the model built is a large comprehensive model of the river system, all the main streams. But if you're talking specifically about how we get the difference between paved and paved, that really comes down to parameters that we use that basically describe the channel roughness. So for a concrete channel, we would use a very low roughness coefficient, so that allows for the water to move much faster, versus a natural channel that's going to use a much higher N value, which will replicate increased roughness, slow that water down. And we can also account for the sinuosity of the channel using different parameters as well.
Thanks so much, Terry. I did also just want to note that we're getting several questions about different pieces of this area. And obviously this is an expansive area that we're studying. I do want to reiterate that we're going to try to stick tonight to a high-level conversation about the study itself. So while there are specific areas that folks may have questions about, those will be followed up with after the meeting, just to make sure that we are staying on topic tonight and addressing the questions that have the greatest impact and relevance to the full area. Jing, I'm going to send our next question to you, and it's from John Stacy. Channel conveyance improvements sound a little outdated, perhaps. How can we focus on protecting wetlands and removing risk structures from inappropriate areas? Can you talk about how some of those considerations were incorporated?
Yes, sure. Thank you for that input. And so, as Terry mentioned, that there are buyouts that are recommended for some of the more frequently flooded structures within the floodplain. And so those that are in the 2-year and 5-year floodplains, we're recommending, buyouts, and that will help preserve the conveyance capacity of the channel. And also, there are opportunities to implement some natural stream improvements that are non-concrete lined. So those are going to be likely going to be explored in the further into the design process. So as Terry had also mentioned, that we're in the planning stage right now. So as this, some of the projects obtain funding, they will move into preliminary engineering and design. And so that's a good concept that the design teams will keep in mind. Thank you.
Okay, great. And Terry, I'm going to kick it over to you to follow up on that as well.
Yeah, I did just want to clarify, when we talk about channel conveyance, it's not necessarily that we're going to be adding a concrete channel. As a matter of fact, most of these are pretty natural channels. Certainly consideration of those natural elements and trying to maintain the habitat and wetlands and things like that are definitely a top priority. We did not intend for these to be added as concrete channels when we did our analysis.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Terry. That's helpful. Adam, I'm going to move our next question to you. Can you give us a little bit of an update on the project to add more gates on Lake Houston and talk about the timeline for that project?
Sure. So we're in the evaluation phase. The team is moving along very quickly. The design team has done a number of things to facilitate increasing that or condensing that schedule. So we're evaluating the different alternatives. We're looking to have those alternatives wrapped up by the end of the year, and we can move into final design. Final design and the ultimate configuration and location of the gates will impact the permitting through the Army Corps of Engineers and FEMA, and the permitting process will then impact the construction schedule. So again, we're looking to wrap up the actual design as quick as possible. But as I said at the Kingwood meeting back in end of last year, the actual construction of the gates is dependent on environmental permitting questions.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Adam. And thanks to James and Sherry for that question. I do have a follow-up from Joe Coleman. Do you feel that those corrections are enough to remove excess water from the watershed? There's a concern that if we put more water into Lake Houston, that could potentially cause more flooding.
So part of that, we're incorporating the findings of this study and the model that was prepared for this study into that analysis. So we are looking at the current inflows into the lake from the entire watershed and looking at, again, the moving enough water out to make sure that there's no adverse impact, that there's no flooding. So yes, we are evaluating all the inflows from both the East Fork and West Fork, everything coming into Lake Houston, and going to design the gates to move water out so that flooding does not occur.
Perfect. Thanks so much. That's helpful clarification. And great to see how this data will be used moving forward. So Gary, our next question is going to come to you. It's from Michael Brookins. He says, subsidence due to groundwater pumping may change the hydraulic and hydrologic characteristics of drainage systems. Can you talk about how we plan to assess those impacts?
Yes. We've kind of had those issues in Harris County for decades. There are specific agencies that basically study the effects of groundwater pumping, both on a regional scale and a local scale. We've kind of observed that when you have differential subsidence where certain smaller areas are really pumping and maybe the region isn't, you can start to see impacts on the floodplain where subsidence is more regional and kind of uniform. You don't really see as many big impacts. I would think that the bigger issue how it would be tackled would just be more long-term monitoring of, groundwater pumping rates and impacts. And Terry had talked about a vision group, somebody kind of taking the lead. These would probably be items that would have to be just monitored over time to determine if it's something that on a regional scale needs to be looked at.
Okay, wonderful. That's helpful. Jing, I'm going to toss it over to you to add on a little bit to that.
So I'm aware that Harris-Galveston Subsidence District is conducting some studies to look at the correlation between flooding and subsidence. I know that they have started looking at an effort in Spring Creek, and it's likely a region-wide effort that they're going to be planning on. But feel free to reach out to them if you guys have any questions on the specifics.
Okay, perfect. And Dina, I'm going to loop you into this one as well.
Sure. Hi there. Yes, I believe the Houston-Galveston Area Subsidence District is going to be conducting a study for the Spring Creek watershed, and they will be making estimates of subsidence in that watershed and looking to see if it does have any impacts on flooding and floodplains within the watershed. But I believe they're just getting prepared to start that project. They haven't started it yet, and I do think it'll be a few months before they're able to get that going. But certainly, you know, towards the end of the year, early next year, I think they'd have some additional information they could share about that effort.
Perfect. Thank you all so much. Great to see collaboration. Terry, our next question is going to come to you, and it's actually from two different people, from Dave and from Bernard. They both have questions about the impact of Atlas rainfall data on this area. Can you talk a little bit about how those considerations were incorporated into the study and what this might look like moving forward?
Yes. So we, as I mentioned, we did use the Atlas 14 rainfall. We want to get the most current conditions that we can. In general, we found, and I'm going to use an average here because obviously the difference between the, let's say the 1% ACE for the current Atlas 14 rainfall and the previous rainfall is going to vary widely across the watershed. But I would say on average, it's about 2 feet difference for the watershed. You know, there's a lot of relation or a lot of discussion about relating the current 500 to the new Atlas 14 100, and I'd say that holds fairly well. As far as specific locations, we have to look at that data to give you the exact answer, but that will be available as the study is released. But I will say that, you know, it did have an impact. If you look at water surface profiles, just to give you a frame of reference, Hurricane Harvey, the flood profiles from Hurricane Harvey fell right in between the 100 and the 500 year for Atlas 14 rainfall, meaning it's somewhere between those two. So if we relate the old Atlas to, or the old rainfall to the new Atlas, and the old 500 looks like the new 100, then those Hurricane Harvey levels were in excess of the old 500. But with the new rainfall data, they're below the 500-year level.
Perfect. Thanks, Terry. And as Terry mentioned, I just wanted to follow up on that and say, you know, as we're getting questions about specific pieces of this big puzzle, we will want to dig into that a little bit, make sure that we're, you know, giving you the most relevant data. So we'll follow up on some of that after this meeting. Dina, I'm going to come to you for our next question, which is from Carolyn Carruthers. Have any bond measures or funds been approved for this project? And are there any construction plans finalized?
Sure. So the recommended projects in this plan will be future projects. So they won't be funded with the 2018 bond program. However, we do have several bond projects within the Harris County portion of the San Jacinto watershed that are included in the 2018 bond program. We've got projects in Cypress Creek, along Spring Creek, some in the Kingwood area, and many, many others. There's more information about where those bond program projects are located on the Flood Control District's website. So while Terry did mention these are large regional projects recommended by this study that would need to have additional funding gathered in the future for them, Flood Control does have additional bond programs, projects that were not mentioned in the presentation this evening.
Perfect. Thanks, Dina. And I'm actually going to stick with you for a quick follow-up question. You know, I think we've all heard a lot about the bond program and what it means for Harris County. Can you talk about how this fits into the overall goals and spirit of that and how we're really moving that forward?
Sure. Well, you know, a lot of the bond projects really are intended to mitigate flood risks and help build resiliency. And one of the major products that we've received from this project is having that collective set of models that Terry talked about earlier. Having the ability to understand what these major channel systems are bringing to Harris County and what we can expect to see during large storm events. So having that data pulled together and developed consistently and cohesively gives us a really powerful tool to understand what flood risks are coming towards our county from north of us.
Thanks so much, Dina. Always helpful to see the big picture. Terry, I'm going to come to you next. We have a question from Jill Bullion. Were nature-based projects considered? And if yes, which ones were considered and how were they assessed?
So I will tell you that at this scale, they were not specifically looked at. But at this scale, we're really looking at a magnitude, an order of magnitude. What would it take to affect significant reductions in water service to remove people from flood risk or reduce their flood risk? So we're looking at, a very high level, and then based on those results and costs and social factors and all those other things, we're providing a general range. Now, I think there's a couple things that get back into the natural aspects that you're asking about. One is the policy consideration for flood preservation. It is definitely our recommendation that we try to preserve as much floodplain as possible for the very reason that I talked about, which is, putting people into the floodplain puts them in harm's way and increases damages. So that's one aspect. The second is that, as these projects move forward and they get selected and they start moving forward with development, that is an opportunity right there to look at specifically what's that project going to look like and what are some of the things that we can do to maintain that natural environment, or to do something like natural stable channel design and really focus on some of those environmental aspects. With respect to the detention basins, these are really just impoundments at this point. We're not, the recommendations are really about impounding water, but keeping everything else kind of in its natural state. So the intent here is not to go in and excavate these large areas. It is to impound water along the natural stream so that we can maintain as much of that existing natural environment as possible.
Thanks so much, Terry. Great answer. And we did have a comment, just kind of as a follow-up to that, come in from Becky Martinez with the Bayou Land Conservancy, talking about some conservation easements that they have in place. And I think this is a great example of why this type of community engagement is so important. Sharing these types of opportunities and, flagging these types of potential collaborations is wonderful and helps us to look at a holistic picture when we're presenting these types of projects. So appreciate that comment. And to that end, I do just want to reiterate how folks can engage with this. You're welcome to submit a comment here on the website, on the study website. Again, that URL is sanjackstudy.org. Or if you're joining us via phone tonight, go ahead and press *3 and you're able to leave a voicemail comment that we'll be posing to our panel of experts. I do want to circle back to the fact that we're getting a lot of specific questions about other flood control district efforts kind of across the area, whether that's in Loose Bayou or other locations across this area. We are going to try to stick a little bit to the big picture just to make sure that, again, we're sharing as much relevant information with folks as we can tonight. And we'll be following up on some of the more specific questions after this event. I also want to reiterate that the slides from this and a recording of tonight's live stream will be available after the event. So if anyone wants to dive in a little bit deeper to one of the slides or hear a little bit more about what we're looking at moving forward, or hear from our panel of experts one more time, this recording will be available and will be hosted on the website. Terry, I think it would be great if we could maybe go back to the community engagement slide and you just talk a little bit more about what we're looking at. I think it's the final slide of the presentation, and just kind of what we're hoping to do with communications and outreach moving forward.
As far as communications and outreach, we obviously are trying to engage with, certainly the community as much as possible. But also we have meetings with various stakeholder groups so that we've had discussions with Kingwood, people in the Kingwood area, like Houston, Montgomery County Drainage Council. We're planning on meeting with them. And then, of course, again, trying to keep information as it comes and as it's finalized, put up on the website so that everybody can have access to that. Jing, did you want to follow up, or anybody? I guess one thing, Gary, did you want to talk about the Kingwood meeting, or just mention that it's going to happen?
I can kind of back to the previous question. This presentation today is on a specific regional watershed study. We have lots of other bond projects with the Harris County Flood Control District that are going on as we speak or are scheduled to be starting that impact a lot of the regional area, on the fringes, areas like Cypress Creek, Kingwood area, Loose Bayou. Specific to Kingwood, we have a specific Kingwood project called the Kingwood feasibility study that we are kind of in the final stages of wrapping up. It was an assessment for specific to Kingwood. It was an assessment of the channels that drain through the Kingwood area. And in the case of that, these channels would be considered too small to have been addressed as part of the San Jacinto study. So we had parallel studies going to kind of look at the issues related to those smaller channels. In addition to that, we have other studies going. Like I said, we have an Atascocita study coming up. Hasn't been initiated yet, but it's on the bond list. Specific to the Kingwood project, we're wrapping that study up, and we're looking at trying to do a public engagement similar to this one. We don't have a specific date yet set, but it'll probably be coming in the coming months. So as soon as we have a better idea of when we're ready for it, we will start scheduling, finding a date, and then publicizing that meeting.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Gary. And Terry, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
I did. You were talking about public communication and outreach, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the Woodlands Drainage Task Force has been a very active partner, and we've been working with them on some of these, specifically some of the Spring Creek things. So I wanted to make sure that we recognize that they've definitely been a partner as well.
Thanks so much, Terry. And Terry, I'm actually going to come back to you for our next question, specifically about the SanJack study. Can you talk a little bit about what's next? You mentioned that we're really looking for people to champion these projects and move some of them forward. Can you talk about what that means? And, we can kind of kick off a conversation about that.
Sure. So the next step for us is to wrap this up. We're getting close to submitting our report. And with that, we'll have obviously loads of technical information, but also sort of a distilled version that really, I think, is going to provide a great summary of the process and the findings. And then I mentioned the presentation working with the upcoming regional flood planning group. I think that's going to be an important part of the next steps. These projects, there's a lot to do, and it is a multi-jurisdictional effort. And so I think having a group like this regional flood planning group spearhead this vision for this particular watershed is going to be an important part of that. So as soon as those groups are formed, getting this study in their hands and being involved, helping them in any way we can to try to move this process forward, I think is going to be the big next step. But ideally, once they have a champion in place, we can start to get some of these short-term strategies moving. Policy, I think that some of the flood warning gauges are a process. And then start to look at which projects we want to try to move forward and what those funding sources might be. But I really feel like, we're going to have a champion to continue to maintain this momentum that we've built with this planning phase.
Thanks so much, Terry. And to that end, Matt, I wondered if you wanted to hop in and just talk a little bit about what SJR is doing.
Sure. Yeah, in addition to all the work and projects that Harris County Flood Control is doing, on flooding throughout the region, SJRA's got several efforts underway, and also several things that we are applying for funding for. Specifically to some of the recommendations or results of this study, we put out a grant application for a couple of the reservoirs that have been recommended by the study team in the Spring Creek watershed. We also have an ongoing project related to installing some sediment removal infrastructure along the San Jacinto River, applying for grants for the next phase of that. Also applying for grants for a regional sedimentation study, which was one of the recommendations coming out of the Sedimentation and Vegetation portion of this effort. And then also just looking forward to being a part of the regional flood planning group that's been mentioned tonight, and continuing to work with flood control and other entities on any projects in the basin that we can.
Thanks so much, Matt. That's helpful. So as we're moving towards a conclusion tonight, I did just want to reiterate that the slides from tonight's presentation that Terry so kindly walked us through and a recording of tonight's live stream will be available on the study's website. That's at sanjackstudy.org, and on the Flood Control District's website. That's hcfcd.org/C17. The video will also be hosted on the Flood Control District's YouTube channel. With that, I'd like to share one final reminder that we are continuing to accept comments and feedback on this project throughout the comment period, which runs all the way through August the 28th. but we do welcome engagement and look for your engagement throughout the duration of this and every project's life cycle. Thank you again for joining us this evening and for your engagement with this work as it continues to move forward. We look forward to continuing to share updates, and we hope everyone stays safe, has a wonderful evening, and continues to join us for these meetings in the future. Have a wonderful night.